What it do, Dream Team? Welcome back to the channel. Here we are with another reaction video, and we're in for a long one. So go ahead, get your snacks ready, get your drinks ready, take a seat, and let's go through this together. In this video, we're going to be watching how Britain became a poor country. A country that invaded over 90% of the world. I believe that's what it said. The biggest empire in the history of the world. How did they fall and become a poor country? Now, before we dive into this, if you happen to enjoy the video, please don't forget to hit subscribe and hit that like button. Also, if you have a video request of your own, I'll take them one of three ways. One being in the comment section. Two, you can subscribe to Patreon and request it there. Or three, in the description section, there's a link where I take free as well as premium requests. See what we got.
Just through these gates here is 10 Downing Street, the official residence of the British Prime Minister.
On Wednesday, the 22nd of May 2024, then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak walked out that front door and announced that he was calling a general election. On paper, it perhaps wasn't the worst political speech ever. It recalled some of the support that Sunak had provided to workers and small businesses during the COVID pandemic, and threw a bit of shade at Keir Starmer, his opponent in the upcoming vote.
In practice, though, Sunak cut a pretty pathetic figure.
Propped up by a lectern as the rain pelted him from above, someone kept knocking the camera, meaning the official broadcast of this historic moment just looked kind of amateurish. Worse still, a protester in the adjoining street had set up a PA system and started blasting "Things Can Only Get Better," a song by one-hit wonders D-Ream, which had previously been used as an election anthem by the Labour Party. Watching Sunak try to win the affections of the British people, whilst being both metaphorically drowned out by an anthem of his political opponents, and literally drowned out by some good old-fashioned British precipitation.
Yeah, that rain coming down, I would have said, hey, we're going to have to reschedule. Can I get an umbrella? Can somebody put an umbrella on this stand? I got to deal with this rain hitting me like this.
Felt rather fitting for a Prime Minister whose tenure had been, honestly, kind of forgettable. It was even more apt for a political party, the Conservative Party, whose 14-year rule over the UK has left the country in tatters. Poorer, nastier, with crumbling schools, bankrupt cities, polluted waterways, and the highest housing-to-income ratio since the Victorian era. On aggregate, the UK remains one of the richest countries in the world.
Oh, number 5.
But it rarely feels that way anymore. Ask anyone that lives here, and they'll attest to the fact that everything is just hideously expensive now.
Bro.
Our politics is pretty...
Listen. We feeling it over here in the US too, dog. It's everything just goes up and up and up, and it feels like you go out there, you make more money, but things just get more expensive, so you're still stuck in the same position that you're in, and it's annoying, it's frustrating, it's crazy. So we feeling it too. We feeling it too over here.
Pretty openly corrupt and chaotic, and the country has been gripped by a general sense of malaise, an understanding that everything is just kind of bad. But how did we get here? How did a country which used to be a pioneer in science, technology, art, and education come to have human poo floating down its rivers? And how do we come back from this?
This is the story of how the British Conservative Party subjected its own country to 3 separate yet interconnected experiments, each of which would tear away a different part of the country's political, social, and economic fabric.
This is the story of how Britain became a poor country. This is David Cameron. On the 11th of May 2010, David Cameron enters 10 Downing Street for the first time as the newly elected Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. His election win hasn't been a particularly convincing one. The party Cameron leads, the Conservatives, have only managed to win 306 seats in the House of Commons. That's 20 seats short of an outright majority. Claiming the top spot has thus required him to go cap in hand to this guy, Nick Clegg, the leader of the UK's notionally centrist Liberal Democrat Party. After 5 days of negotiations, Cameron and Clegg have agreed to form a coalition government, in which Cameron will serve as Prime Minister and Clegg as his deputy.
Coalition governments in which multiple parties come together to govern collaboratively are exceptionally rare in the UK. The last time this happened was during the 1930s and 1940s, when all the major parties in Parliament came together to present a united front during the Second World War. As David Cameron crosses the threshold of number 10, however, he perhaps feels like this collaborative arrangement might serve him well.
See, David Cameron is, at this point at least, a genre of centre-right politician which would soon go wildly out of fashion. He's certainly a great supporter of typical conservative causes such as tax cuts, privatisations and reductions in welfare spending, but he's also desperate to at least present himself as youthful, environmentally conscious and broadly socially liberal. Some of this social liberalism is perhaps sincere. As Prime Minister, he'll soon push for the UK to adopt equal marriage, despite solid opposition from other Conservatives. He'll also lead a revolution in offshore...
Does the UK not already have same-sex marriage? Is that not a thing already? Y'all let me know in the comment section, because I don't know. So y'all let me know in the comment section. Is that not already a thing over there?
And had already managed to promote greater gender equality among political candidates within his party. Although, this being the 2000s, the British press had soon christened them Cameron's cuties, which, yeah. Perhaps more suspect is the idea which sits at the centre of Cameron's vision for Britain, the Big Society.
The Big Society is intended, in part, as a corrective to that eternal Conservative bogeyman of big government. Cameron's pitch is that he's going to empower individuals, charities and community groups to take a more active role in civic life. In its opposition to big government, however, the Big Society doesn't stop at cutting red tape and government oversight. All that charity work is intended to make up for a brutal programme of cuts to public services.
It's fair to say that the UK's finances aren't exactly in the best of shape at this point. This is just 2 years after the global financial crisis of 2008, and the country is still very much dealing with the aftermath. In order to prevent the complete collapse of the country's banking and housing sectors, the previous government has paid to effectively nationalise 2 banks and shelled out to buy significant ownership stakes in 2 more. A fall in real terms earnings, along with people being more cautious with how they spend their money, means tax receipts have also taken a hit. The state of affairs is perhaps best captured by a handwritten note left by Labour's outgoing Chief Secretary of the Treasury to his successor, which reads simply, "Dear Chief Secretary, I'm afraid there is no money. Best regards, and good luck." Over the next 5 years...
I'm afraid there is no money. Best regards, good luck. What you mean? Ain't no money? No. What do you mean?
Cameron references this note often. He sometimes waves it about at campaign events. Not only does the memo help to portray Cameron's political rivals in the Labour Party as having a carefree attitude when it comes to taxpayer cash, the notion that the country is flat broke provides a rationale for taking a pretty uncompromising approach to cutting government spending.
As things stand, the UK government is running a budget deficit of £150 billion. Cameron and his government unveil a plan to cut that number as quickly as possible.
It doesn't matter that interest rates are at their lowest since 1694 and that the cost of the government's borrowing is effectively zero. Cameron and Osborne want to slash the size of the state. And there has perhaps never been a better excuse to do so. The package of spending cuts implemented over the next few years includes reforms to the welfare system, which make it harder for disabled people and sick people to access support. It involves a 13% cut in funding for schools and colleges, as well as a 40% cut to funding for universities, made up for by shifting the burden of tuition costs onto students through a tripling of fees. Anyone working in the public sector has their pay frozen for 2 years, and subsequent annual pay rises capped at 1%. Police funding, defense...
I can tell you right now, David Cameron ain't getting in. Unless it already happened and he got in, but yeah, he cutting a little bit too much. I don't see this happening. God dang. So cut off welfare. Cut off 1/6 of school spending. Increase the tuition of the college students. cut police, cut police funny. Like, hey, I don't know, David. You pull this one off, though. Then you might just be the right man for the job. If you can pull this off, what does he stay? What? So far, I'm hearing this number one more policy is he's just trying to cut the overspending, basically, because UK is just overspending way too much, is what I'm hearing. And so he needs to cut that. But these are taking cuts from a lot of major categories, I feel like. Let's keep listening.
Spending and public transport spending all receive swinging cuts, whilst the Royal Mail, the UK's postal service, is sold off to investors at a bargain basement price.
It's hard to get across in just a short section of one video quite how wide-ranging Cameron, Clegg and Osborne's attack on public spending is. There's not a single part of British public life that goes untouched. And judged on its own terms, it's pretty successful.
By 2015, the deficit has dropped by more than a third. Nevertheless, the effects on the economy and country more broadly are mixed. Throughout the 5 years of the coalition government, George Osborne repeatedly tells Brits that, quote, "we're all in this together."
So this already happened. It's not that y'all voting, they're trying to be voted in. This has already happened. Is that what I'm hearing?
Comes to this attempt to fix public finances. Nevertheless, the pain of austerity is felt strongest by the poorest in society. In fact, at the same time as work for ordinary people is becoming more precarious and less well paid, corporation tax, the tax paid by companies on their profits, is gradually brought down from 28% to just 20%. By 2015, the grim reality of Cameron's big society is evident in the rise of food banks. 5 years ago, food banks had been essentially non-existent in the UK. The country's most prominent food bank charity had handed out just 40,000 packages that entire year. But by 2015, that figure has risen to more than 1 million. The result of...
Yeah, okay, so David Cameron was already voted in this cuts policy. Was he saying this before he was voted in and people still voted for him? So his policy worked in the sense of it cut everything. But the people of Britain felt it, especially those who weren't the big corporations, big companies, the regular everyday folk felt it brutally, it looked like. Let me look at that graph again. Look at this. In 2010, 2011, I think what they said was at 40,000. In 2015, the number of food banks handing out, I guess the number of things they handed out was 1 million parcels. Jesus Christ, man. The way that graph just sloped so upwardly is nasty work. My God. So it's like he did cut spending. But my God, was it worth the price? Was it worth the cost? So many people, I'm sure that created a lot of people going into poverty. I'm sure that created homelessness. I'm sure, as you can see in the graph, that created having to depend more on these food banks and things such as that and charity. And it just made life a real struggle for all the people while these corporations and companies were actually getting their taxes cut lower and lower year by year.
2015, that figure has risen to more than 1 million.
God.
The result of Cameron's policies, then, is not some utopian empowerment of local communities, but one in which people who previously could have found support and guidance in the welfare system becoming reliant on charity to feed themselves and their families.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, as the impact of Cameron and Clegg's cuts begin to be felt, there's a sense that these policies might not be super popular amongst the general public. The coalition years are beset with protests and strikes and demonstrations by various groups affected by the austerity regime.
And if it's easy to disregard such activists as a vocal minority, the notion that UK voters might be experiencing a touch of buyer's remorse quickly becomes evident in the polls too. By the end of 2010, the Labour Party has overtaken Cameron's Conservatives in the polls, a lead they maintain consistently for the next 4 years. The right-wing press mercilessly lampooned the Labour Party leader, Ed Miliband, for his slightly meek, awkward aura, including through publishing this unflattering photo of him eating a bacon sandwich. Nevertheless, while Labour's polling lead drops, they still retain a slight lead.
On the day of the 2015 general election, it looks very much like Cameron might be a one-term wonder. The results are certainly set to be close, but there's a chance that Ed Miliband and the Labour Party might be able to piece together an alternative coalition of smaller parties to oust Cameron and the Conservatives from power. Then, that evening, all those predictions turn out to be false.
When the
No
results are
way.
counted, the Conservatives turn out not to have lost support, but gained it. Their 306 MPs have become 331. Enough to end their pact with the Liberal Democrats and govern solo. Everyone involved in the entire polling industry spends the next year or so hanging their heads in shame. Among several proposed reasons for why they got it so wrong is the so-called shy Tory effect. This is the idea that some voters, when asked, will be hesitant to admit that they're going to vote Conservative. Presumably something about not wanting to appear pro-food bank and declining life expectancy or something. In some ways then, Cameron exits the 2015 general election more confident than ever. He had
This man who just put so many people in the country through absolute awfulness really won again? How, Sway? I thought surely there's no way. There is no way they vote for him again. It's not possible. It's not happening. Their party's out of there. They won again. I guess it worked for more people than not. What he did, that would be the only reason I assume that he could have won this thing. I can't think of no other reason.
Has an outright majority in Parliament and a reassuring sense that there might be greater support for his austerity agenda than there sometimes appears.
That confidence is about to be undercut, however, by a new threat: the rise of the Brexiteers.
The Brexit boys.
To understand this next part of the story, we need to take another look at this graph.
There's a lot that pollsters got wrong when calculating voting patterns prior to the 2015 general election. But one thing they did spot correctly was a steady rise in support for the UK Independence Party, or UKIP for short. UKIP are a right-wing party who, in 2015, are led by this guy, Nigel Farage. And while they maintain a broad manifesto of policies, their primary mission is to get the UK to leave the European Union, which isn't an entirely fringe desire. Support for the EU has fluctuated constantly since the UK joined the bloc back in the 1970s, particularly as a result of its impact on immigration.
See, under EU rules, citizens of any member state have the right to move to and work in any other member state. And since the early 2000s, net migration to the UK from within the EU has been trending further and further upwards.
All of the available research suggests that this has a positive impact on the UK economy. But in an era of economic downturn, immigrants have become an easy scapegoat. David Cameron has often joined in on this scapegoating, making high-profile promises to bring net migration down into the tens of thousands. Nevertheless, support for UKIP continues to rise. And in 2014, one of Cameron's own MPs even defects to the party in protest at his perceived inaction on the issue. The result is that Cameron decides that he has to do something in order to avoid losing more support. His solution? To pinch UKIP's own key policy of holding a referendum on EU membership. A nationwide vote presenting Brits with a binary choice: in or out.
Cameron's reason for calling the vote is because he feels pretty certain that the Remain campaign is going to win. He wants to prove that whatever concerns might exist around immigration, that wanting to leave the EU is little more than a fringe obsession of a vocal minority. This, of course, is not what happens.
The first blow to Cameron's plan comes just a day after he announces the referendum. That afternoon, he receives a text message from this guy, Boris Johnson. Having been to both school and university with Cameron, Johnson had previously been something of an ally. But in his message that morning, Johnson declares whatever truce there might have been between them to be over, and says that he'll be throwing his full weight behind the Leave campaign.
Johnson soon emerges as the Leave team's de facto leader, and agitating to leave the EU turns out to be a whole lot easier than campaigning to stay in. It might be that all the available evidence suggests that staying a member of the European Union is the more prosperous economic choice for the UK, but explaining why is kind of boring and technocratic. Whatever the evidence suggests, it's just kind of difficult to inspire some kind of deep adoration for a somewhat bureaucratic trading bloc.
I can
The Leave
understand
campaign,
that.
by contrast, is free to weave a highly emotive narrative, which stitches together a whole range of distinct issues under the banner, Take Back Control. This notion of taking back control is partly about immigration, but it also taps into a whole range of anxieties about the country's declining influence on the world stage, and even cuts to public services, which are reframed as no longer being a political choice made by the Conservative Party, but the result of a need to send great sums of cash to Europe.
In fact, the success of the Take Back Control narrative is that voters can kind of project whatever they want onto it. It allows Brits to take whatever their frustrations might be with contemporary Britain, no matter whether they are real or relevant, and redirects that anger at the EU.
And it works.
That makes sense. That makes sense. That makes sense. So they basically just use the EU as basically the scapegoat for all of the issues and all the problems that were happening in the UK and everything everybody was frustrated about. They figured, okay, well, if we leave the EU, all our problems will be solved. Because that's what they were being told by these Leave leaders, that it's the EU's fault. But while the people who were the leaders of the Remain, like Team Remain, were like, it's more prosperous for us to stay, but we can't, right? It's harder to get people behind it because it's more of a boring process of explaining things. And it's not like you can just throw everything on the EU and get people, you know what I'm saying, hype behind this movement, because everyday people go through so many problems. And if they have something to blame it on, then they can get behind the Leave Party. Whereas the Stay Party didn't, because contemporary Britain, I guess, wasn't as great as people wanted, there was nothing for them to hang their hat on. Of course, staying was a better option economically, but they couldn't explain that in an exciting way, I guess, to get people behind it.
At 4:40 a.m. on the 24th of June 2024, the BBC announces that Britain has voted to leave the European Union by 51.89% to 48.11%. Throughout the referendum campaign, David Cameron had promised that he'd continue to serve as Prime Minister regardless of the outcome of the vote. Not 10 hours passes after polls close, however, before he reneges on that pledge entirely and resigns.
David Cameron knew the writing on the wall. David Cameron saw the writing on the wall. He said, if we leave the EU, I'm not finna take all the blame for it, because we ain't gonna have the EU to blame no more. And I mean, all the fingers are gonna get pointed at the person in charge, and I'm not gonna be the one to take that blame. So, even though I said I was gonna stay, I said that because I thought we was gonna stay in the EU. I didn't think there was a real chance of us leaving, but now that we left, I got to go.
It's interpreted by many as a somewhat sad attempt to escape the consequences of his own actions, and in so being, sets the stage for plenty of other prime ministerial resignations to come. The logical assumption following Cameron's resignation might have been that Boris Johnson would take over as PM. He had, after all, effectively led the Leave campaign, and this would be the perfect opportunity to see his vision for a post-EU Britain through. After days of speculation, however, he bottles it at the last minute, and the leadership contest is won instead by this woman, Theresa May. One of May's stock slogans during her campaign to become Prime Minister is "Brexit means Brexit." The challenge is that no one's entirely sure what Brexit means means. The narrative of taking back control had been intentionally vague, but actually leaving the EU would require concrete, specific policy.
Given the desperately thin margin on which the referendum was won, the logical thing to do is perhaps to find some kind of compromise. Maybe the UK ceases to be a full member of the EU and introduces some additional controls on immigration, but retains a close trading relationship with the bloc. The problem is that the referendum debate has only really hardened opinion on all sides.
For many Brexit-supporting members of the Conservative Party, the only acceptable way forward is to make a complete break from Europe and to seek closer ties with the US instead. Opposing these are a smattering of pro-Europe activists and MPs across the major parties who are dead set on frustrating the process entirely. May's one point of solace is that public support for the Conservatives has been steadily rising since the referendum, as voters who had been drifting towards UKIP have come rushing back to the Conservatives. She therefore decides that what the country needs is another election. Her hope is to increase her majority in Parliament and thus make it slightly easier to pass the various bills necessary to facilitate an orderly Brexit. Much like Cameron's gamble with the referendum, however, this is not what happens.
Oh, Lord.
The following election campaign is a car crash for May, who turns out to be almost impressively uncharismatic. At one point, she tells a reporter from ITV that the most rebellious thing she's ever done is run through a field of wheat.
I saw that. I saw that in a different video. Jesus. Oh my God. Okay, UK. It's just y'all just lacking leadership is what it seems like. And coming from the US, I can understand.
When questioned on policy, she has a habit of simply repeating stock slogans about the need for, quote, strong and stable government.
The result is that come election day, May doesn't secure the increased majority she expected, but loses seats instead.
Clinging onto power thus requires her to form a pact with the right-wing Democratic Unionist Party. Worse still, the parliament she's overseeing is now more fractured than ever. There's both relatively high representations from smaller parties and a set of increasingly stark factional divisions within each of the main parties, all of whom want something quite different out of Brexit. This means that gathering enough votes to pass a Brexit deal through Parliament becomes even more complicated than it was before. In November 2018, May announces that she's negotiated a withdrawal agreement with the EU, which will outline the future relationship between the UK and Europe. Nevertheless, the deal contains special protections in order to avoid the UK having to build a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And while these protections are intended to avoid any disruptions or complications to the Northern Irish peace process, for the most committed Brexiteers, they represent an unforgivable failure to completely detach from the EU. After 3 failed attempts to get her agreement through Parliament, May decides that she's had enough. Once again, the nation tunes in to watch a Conservative Prime Minister stand in front of 10 Downing Street and announce that they're going to walk away from their responsibilities.
She said, F all this. She said, don't nobody agree with me, I guess I can't get past what the things I want to get past, so what's the point of being in this seat? Y'all don't believe in me, y'all don't want to see my policies through, F it. Put someone that y'all gonna believe in the seat. Put someone in the seat that can make things happen. Because obviously, y'all ain't rolling with me. So I'm up out of here.
The fog of failure and defeat becomes harder to ignore.
With the UK's top job vacant once again, Boris Johnson decides that his time has come. And his fellow Conservatives clearly agree. He sweeps the subsequent leadership contest and officially takes over as Prime Minister on the 24th of July 2019.
Johnson's approach differs from May's in 2 key ways. Firstly, Johnson is far less worried about the prospect of a so-called no-deal Brexit, in which the country simply crashes out of the EU without having negotiated a future trading relationship with it. Secondly, he's much more ruthless in his attempts to outmaneuver his opponents.
In August 2019, Johnson takes the extreme decision to drive to Buckingham Palace and to persuade the Queen to effectively suspend Parliament for a month. His goal is partly to silence his critics within Parliament, but also to essentially run down the clock on Brexit negotiations, to the point either that the EU is forced to accept greater concessions on any deal, or that a no-deal Brexit happens by default.
This move has the effect of irritating basically everyone. The Supreme Court rules his suspension of Parliament to have been illegal, and Johnson is forced to return to a House of Commons that is somehow now even more divided than before. He thus decides that what the UK needs is another election. And this time, well, it actually does go to plan. Johnson campaigns using another three-word slogan, "Get Brexit done."
Okay.
And to a nation exhausted by 3.5 years of trade talks and treaties, the notion of simply getting it over with clearly appeals. Johnson secures a landslide victory with 365 seats to Labour's 203.
When Johnson manages to renegotiate Theresa May's failed deal and get it passed through Parliament, it appears that Britain is firmly exiting its Brexit era. The consequences will certainly be felt for years to come, but the political wranglings at least begin to die down. Okay. And they do so just in time for a new challenge to appear in the form of COVID-19.
Dang. Challenge the world had to face.
First comes several weeks of watching the infection spread through China and Europe. Then, on the 30th of January 2020, the first 2 cases of COVID-19 are documented in Britain. Public health measures are introduced slowly at first. Reminders to wash hands, bans on large gatherings, mandated quarantine for people arriving in the UK from certain high-risk countries. Then, on the 23rd of March, Boris Johnson appears on national TV to announce a nationwide lockdown.
Johnson had initially been pretty sceptical about invoking such a measure. Ever the Conservative, he was worried about the impact that shutting everyone in their houses might have on business.
He briefly considered actively allowing the disease to spread across the country to build so-called herd immunity through infection. Never.
Jesus Christ. Herd immunity is insane for the COVID-19 disease. What? Okay. I will.
Nevertheless, with deaths rising exponentially, doing nothing eventually becomes untenable. With everyone stuck inside, glued to the TV, it's perhaps only right that politics becomes a bit of a soap opera over the next few months. First, Johnson himself contracts COVID, and swiftly goes from being entirely unconcerned by the disease to lying in an intensive care unit in St. Thomas Hospital. Then, this guy, Johnson's chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, gets caught out for having broken lockdown rules by visiting his wife 5 hours away whilst displaying COVID symptoms. Amid these controversies, Johnson's allies in the Conservative Party find numerous ways to use the pandemic to funnel money into the wallets of their friends. It quickly becomes apparent that the country's National Health Service is going to need a whole load of additional masks, aprons, and other protective gear. Johnson & Co. thus leveraged this urgency to suspend anti-corruption laws around government outsourcing. Billions of pounds worth of public money is handed over to the friends and acquaintances of government ministers, in some cases in return for equipment which is entirely unusable.
Whether through illegitimate means or not, protecting the interests of business remains at the top of the government's agenda throughout the pandemic.
I've always said, no matter what, dog. When it comes to politics, the people at the top are almost never hurt. Because they're the ones running the show. Because it's the elite, it's the corporations, it's the companies, it's the richest people that get what they want in the long run. They get their way while it leaves the rest of people to suffer. That's the way the world works, it feels like. That's how I know it works in the U.S. That's how I know it works. But it sounds like that's how it's working in the U.K. I think that's how the world works. I guess the elite, or they'll do whatever it takes to hold on to power, to hold on to money, to gain more power, to gain more money, at the cost of all of us people who are not a part of the elite.
Efforts to keep things ticking over financially are led by this guy, Rishi Sunak.
Remember him from the beginning?
When the first national lockdown ends in summer 2020, all sense of caution is thrown out of the window in favour of getting things back to normal as soon as possible. In August, Sunak launches a scheme called Eat Out to Help Out. This sees the government subsidising meals bought in restaurants to encourage people to get out of their houses and support the hospitality sector. And people go for it, gobbling up 160 million state-subsidised meals between them. This might be good for Nando's and
50% off. I'm probably going out to eat too.
Pizza Express, but it's less good for anyone who wants the pandemic to be over.
I feel
Sunak's scheme contributes to a near doubling of cases during that month. And very quickly, all the progress made throughout the first lockdown appears to be in vain, as cases begin to rise exponentially once more. Boris Johnson spends the rest of the year trying and failing to avoid implementing further lockdowns. At one point, he tells colleagues that he would rather let the bodies pile high than confine people to their homes again. Nevertheless, the rise in cases eventually becomes too significant to ignore, and the UK is subjected to 2 more national lockdowns during 2020 and 2021. The Conservative Party's lead in the polls, which had peaked at 22% whilst Johnson was in hospital, takes a bit of a tumble during these chaotic months of last-minute lockdowns. But by the spring, a successful COVID vaccine rollout puts Johnson on the up again. In May, the Conservatives win a historic by-election victory in Hartlepool, and things look stronger still. Sure, there might be a lack of lorry drivers and a shortage of basic foods in the supermarket as a result of Johnson's Brexit deal, but the politician known to many simply as Boris continues to have a broad base of support. Behind the scenes, he reportedly talks of wanting to remain in power for a decade.
Then it all comes crashing down.
In November 2022, the Daily Mirror publishes an article revealing that Boris Johnson and his staff had hosted several staff parties in 10 Downing Street the previous Christmas. This flew directly in the face of rules banning social gatherings, rules which had been drawn up in that very same building. The Prime Minister's office initially denies these reports, but footage and photos soon begin to emerge. All in all, 17 parties are found to have taken place among staff, and both Johnson and Rishi Sunak are eventually fined for breaking the law. Johnson's political career had rarely been without scandal, but the clear hypocrisy of the PM setting rules whilst ignoring them himself helps this one to stick. Even the usually die-hard Conservative press begins to turn on him. Then, a few weeks later, Johnson attempts to promote an MP who's been credibly accused of multiple accounts of sexual assault, and his fellow MPs begin resigning from Johnson's government.
Come on, Boris. You just started effing up left and right, dog. It seemed like you had the support of the people. It seemed like they was and then you just effing up left and right. You lost it for yourself.
En masse.
Come on, man.
On the 8th of July 2022, the man who just recently had been eyeing up a decade in power is forced to make that now iconic, shameful walk out the front door of 10 Downing Street to announce his resignation. He leaves the country with one more 3-word phrase for good measure. Them's the breaks.
It once seemed almost certain that whenever Boris Johnson did retire, he'd be succeeded by Rishi Sunak. Regardless of the disaster of Eat Out to Help Out, Sunak had gone to great lengths to use COVID to further his personal brand.
But remember all those MPs that Boris Johnson had expelled from the Conservative Party during the Brexit debates? Well, those expulsions, along with the broader polarisation of the Brexit process, had led many of the party's more socially liberal members to jump ship. The result being that the party is now comprised almost solely of hardline right-wingers and libertarians. Sunak does throw his hat in the ring then, but the contest is eventually won by this woman, Liz Truss. Now, as we've already seen, the Conservative Party has always been a party of low taxes and cuts to government spending. But Liz Truss is something else. A one-time contributor to a book called Britannia Unchained, Truss is an unabashed, unreformed libertarian who doesn't so much believe in a small state as no state. Unless, of course, it's serving the needs of the super-rich. In fact, Truss turns out to be so extreme in her low-tax fundamentalism that she almost bankrupts the entire country in just a matter of weeks. On the 23rd of September 2022, Truss unveils a package of economic policies which revolve around £45 billion worth of tax cuts to the country's richest. And remember, this is a country which was
I told y'all who always getting their way. No, it seems like no matter what person's in office, who always getting their way is the elite, is the rich. Somehow.
Already suffered more than a decade of austerity, and in which every public service, from the NHS to the police, is at crisis point. So she decides to fund these tax cuts through increased government borrowing.
Global financial markets usually quite like tax cuts, but Truss's approach is viewed as so bold as to be reckless. Investors quickly come to view holding investments in the UK as far too risky and start selling off government bonds and currency.
The value of the pound plummets, and more importantly for the Conservative Party, interest rates on mortgages begin to rise. The result is that any support for Truss among MPs, party members and voters falls through the floor. The Daily Star posts a live stream of a lettuce on YouTube, wagering that Truss's failure is so bad that she'll resign before the lettuce wilts. And a few days later, the lettuce claims victory. Just 49 days after she first entered, Truss walked back out of 10 Downing Street and, you guessed it, resigns. In doing so, she becomes the shortest serving Prime Minister in UK history.
49
Perhaps
days
unsurprisingly, Truss's chaotic leadership sees the Conservatives' polling numbers drop to new lows. Labour had first taken the lead during Partygate, but the gap has now widened to the point that the Conservatives are a full 30 points behind. For once then, the party decides that the country doesn't need another election. MPs line up to support Rishi Sunak in taking over the top job, and on the 25th of October 2022, he becomes Prime Minister of the UK. Sunak tries time and again to rekindle the UK's love affair with the Conservatives. At the beginning of 2023, he makes 5 promises to the British people, mostly based on getting the economy moving again. Nevertheless, progress on these is patchy. The only target which actually gets met is his promise to bring down inflation, but that's more to do with falling energy prices than anything he's done himself.
After some initial movement in the right direction then, support for Sunak and the Conservatives continues to slide. And the more that Sunak's attempts to win back voters from the Labour Party are met with failure, the more he decides simply to double down on trying to hold on to the small rump of voters that his party has retained.
This involves leaning into the very worst right-wing obsessions. Sunak and his allies begin devising increasingly cruel punishments for asylum seekers and blocking access to healthcare for trans people. Sunak tries to hold on for as long as he can, hoping for some kind of miracle. But at this point, it's just too late. After 14 years in power, more than £100 billion in cuts to public services, one Brexit referendum, countless corrupt COVID PPE deals, and a self-inflicted economic crisis, the consequences of Conservative governance are plain for all to see. A country which has been asset stripped by austerity, cut off from its closest trading partners, and in which spiking inflation and interest rates have sent rents, mortgages, bills, and pretty much everything else through the roof, at the same time as real terms wages have fallen. On the 22nd of May 2024 then, Sunak finally gives up. He steps out.
Jesus Christ. Bro. It's switching so much. They are lasting months at this point before they call it a day. My God. I mean, no matter what party is in power, people are going to be displeased because that's just life. Like, there's gonna be things parties can't do for you. There's gonna be things that they're not gonna, I guess, not that you're not gonna agree with. So I think no matter who you put in power, you're just gonna be, at the end of the day, people are gonna be upset and displeased at all the things that happen while that person is in power. I think Brexit really hit hard when it comes in terms of the UK, and I think that really hit them much harder than they thought it would. And so now, like, I'm sure it's got to be very hard to be the leader and lead the country on the right path. But like I said, no matter who's leading the country, I think they're just put in a very difficult position. And then they're going to be taking the blame for a lot of things.
Side 10 Downing Street, walks up to his podium and stares down the lens of that press ball camera. This is not a resignation, but it certainly feels like one.
It's hard to stress how impressive the complete and total implosion of the Conservative Party is. The UK sometimes gets described as having a two-party political system, given to how the Conservative and Labour parties dominate election results. But in practice, it basically has a one-party system.
Of the past 100 years, the Conservative Party has been in power for more than 70 of them. At time of recording, it looks pretty certain that same party is going to lose the next election, big time.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's already happened by the time you're watching this video. But whether the party eventually bounces back from that defeat or not, the experiments they've inflicted on the country have left damage which will last a long, long time.
Facts.
Perhaps most worrying is the extent to which some of the basic precepts of those experiments have come to be accepted by Sunak's rivals in the Labour Party. On the 4th of July, it looks very likely that it will be Labour leader Keir Starmer walking into 10 Downing Street as the new Prime Minister. Starmer has repeatedly criticised Liz Truss's disastrous reforms and Boris Johnson's lies. Nevertheless, he's completely walked back on his earlier support for a referendum on rejoining the EU, and he remains committed to an economic approach grounded in austerity.
In the same way that David Cameron once waved that note stating that there was no money left, Keir Starmer has repeatedly used Liz Truss's trashing of the economy as a reason to scale back his promises.
His manifesto retains most of the Conservatives' cuts to welfare, has a much less ambitious approach to tackling climate change than he once promised, and suggests the party will promote further privatisation of the NHS. In fact, where you would think an election campaign would mostly revolve around the two main parties criticising each other over their specific plans for government, the current contest has largely consisted of each party criticising the other for daring to want to spend any money, which is a problem. Because after 14 years of cuts and mismanagement, the UK needs investment, and lots of it. Last year, one researcher at the Institute for Public Policy suggested that the UK had contracted a debilitating case of investment phobia, in which the government refuses to invest in infrastructure, which leads to businesses not wanting to invest either.
Oof.
Combine that with the country having been cut off from its closest trading partners and a crisis of trust in politics, and you end up with a country that feels so much poorer than it once did. Fixing that is going to be one hell of a task, and the challenge for Keir Starmer is that if he can't make a very real difference to people's lives pretty quickly, then he might find that his party's popularity is pretty short-lived. As many of you will know, the UK election isn't the only election taking place this year.
In November, our American friends will also be Pokemon going to the polls to elect the next president of the United States.
And I'm going to be heading over to the US to cover it.
In fact, if you're watching this video shortly after it comes out, there's a good chance I'm currently either in Milwaukee, chatting to folks at the Republican National Convention, or scooting around the US on my way to New York, Washington, Florida, and a handful of other places to chat to some people there.
The filming that I'm going to be doing whilst I'm out there is all for my upcoming feature-length documentary, Boomers. Boomers is going to be the biggest thing that I've ever made.
It's being produced by Nebula, the creator-owned streaming service.
I'm gonna skip the sponsor, Nebula. But I want to see kind of the trailer.
Proper film.
As you might have guessed, Boomers isn't just about the current US election. It might begin by talking about the somewhat advanced age of the current main candidates, one of whom is actually too old to be a baby boomer, but it uses this as the jumping off point to ask much bigger questions about age and politics and wealth and inequality. It explores how the baby boomers, the largest generation of humans ever to be born in the global north, were able to use the strength of numbers that they had to rebuild our politics and economy to work in their favour. It asks what legacy they're leaving to their children, the new challenges that are going to emerge as the boomers themselves get even older, and what those of us in younger generations might have to do to clean up after them.
As I mentioned, Boomers is a Nebula original production, and some of you might already know a little bit about Nebula.
It's a collaboration between myself and a whole bunch.
The rest of it just kind of him promoting Nebula. But yeah, I think whoever the UK puts in power next just has to be patient. The people have to be patient and allow them to try their policies, and because I feel like these guys are only lasting like a month or two and they're just being kicked right out, when it's going to take time to get, I guess, the UK back on the right path, to get and that investment phobia is going to have to go away. But I don't know. When it comes to politicians, I ain't never trusted one. Because I don't think, if I'm being honest, I don't think they're the ones running the show. I always think there's a group of people behind the scenes that we will never know about that really do run things. They really run the show, that pull the strings. But, of course, they hold all the power without us knowing that they have the power, which is incredible. That's all we have for this video, though. Y'all let me know y'all's thoughts in the comment section. If you guys enjoyed that, check this one out next. Also, make sure you subscribe and give the video a like. I'll see you on the next one.